In any case, I'll keep my remarks brief, so if you don't catch every word, that's fine. It's not important. But it is important that on behalf of the Institute for Comparative Modernities, I'd like to welcome everyone today to the first of our series of events for the academic year 2014 and 15. And today, we're honored and delighted to have as our inaugural speaker, Professor Raymond Craib from the Department of History here at Cornell. And I'll leave it to the resident director of the Institute, Barry Maxwell, to introduce Professor Craib later. But for now, let me just make a few general remarks, including some informational material. First of all, as many of you already know, for those of you who've attended ICM events through the years, I don't have to say this, but for those of you who may be new to some of our programming, let me just say that the Institute for Comparative Modernities, since its inception in 2007, has really been engaged with a key problem in the study of modern culture and society, and that's specifically the transnational history of modernity and its global scope. And over the past few decades, we've seen a lot of scholarship and a lot of cultural production that's emerged to challenge and to really complicate this particular, that's challenged and complicated a particular dominant narrative of modernity. And what it's tried to challenge and to complicate are the two primary storylines of this narrative. And that's one, that modernity arose strictly within the confines of Europe, and that two, that its extension outside Europe was merely a matter of simple diffusion or imitation. And the ICM over the years has dedicated itself to addressing modernity from both a transnational and a comparative perspective, and has actively encouraged attention to neglected or understudied articulations of modernity outside of the hegemonic spaces of Europe and the US. And to that end, we can look forward to Professor Craib's lecture today, which will no doubt offer the kind of rich historical archive and intellectual provocations necessary to advancing conversations in this area. And for those of you who may be new to the Institute's programs, you may want to pick up a copy of one of our recent newsletters. There are a number of them at the back of the room on that table there. And that should give you some sense of the kinds of intellectual and political interests that have taken up the life of the ICM. And also, you'll find at the back of the room a quarter card with some of this fall's upcoming events. And let me just announce them briefly. I won't go into them in detail because you can pick up the information there. Along with our inaugural lecture today, we're also going to have a screening of a film by John Akomfra called The Stuart Hall Project. And that will be accompanied by a panel of speakers, including speakers from Cornell and from outside of Cornell. And we also have a critical theory and post-colonialism workshop that's lined up for December. And the Akomfra screening project is in November 11th. But again, all of the details will be listed on the quarter cards at the back there. And finally, if you're new to the programming and events of the ICM, and if you'd like to be notified of upcoming events, there's a sign-up sheet also at the back there where you can put down your name and email address and be added to the listserv for the ICM. And the last thing that I want to mention is that following the lecture and the Q&A, there'll be a reception with light refreshments in the History of Art Gallery. So if you're not sure where that is, if you go out the doors on my left, your right, at the back of the room, and turn right, just walk down the hall and you'll get to the History of Art Gallery. So without any further ado then, I'll turn things over to the Resident Director, Barry Maxwell, who will introduce today's speaker. Thank you.
Good afternoon. One thing I want to mention initially and stress is if you're having any trouble hearing the speaker today, or if you're having any trouble hearing me now, either thumbs up or raise your hand, because too many of these events pass by without sufficient clarity. on the audio level. So if anyone needs to speak louder, let's stop and get that adjusted. It's really a pleasure today to introduce Ray Craib, who is a friend and a colleague, and I would even say, and I'll defend the term in the reception, a comrade. Ray is an associate professor in Cornell's history department. He studied with James C. Scott at Yale. He has received numerous professional awards and served on many professional committees at Cornell and in the wider world. He is an innovative teacher, popular in the best sense. He has given of his time for projects addressing the situation and needs of migrant workers in Tompkins County and beyond. Ray is also the author of Cartographic Mexico, A History of State Fixations and Fugitive Landscapes, which was published by Duke in 2004. That book, at the same time that it traces the complexities of the Mexican instance of surveying, map-making, and the establishment of territorial boundaries, collaterally develops the theoretical constructs noted in the subtitle, that is, state fixation and landscape as fugitive. Now, I want to say a word about the first of these, state fixation. By this term, Ray means something different from, but not at odds with, the early 20th century American anarchist Randolph Bourne's characterization of a kind of fixation of the state. Loyalty, Bourne wrote, or the mystic devotion to the state becomes the major imagined human value. Cartographic Mexico is less concerned with loyalty to the state as a fixed idea or even a compulsion in both the psychological and disciplinary senses than it is with than it is with the mediations of surveying and cartography as two-way epistemological conduits. Ray writes in that book, in rural Mexico, both before and after the revolution, surveyors were among the most prominent figures through which villagers experienced something known as the state. At the same time, if villagers often experienced the state in the form of the surveyor, federal officials and a burgeoning bureaucracy saw or came to know the countryside through the surveyor. End quote. Ray identifies as state fixation several outcomes of the modern Mexican cartographic project, among them the privatization of communal lands, the delineation and archiving of village, municipal, state, and national boundaries, and the determination of watercourses and riparian rights, unquote. I want to make one point about this book, which has been of great value to me on many levels. This book is of use to the anti-statist position, that is, to anarchism, because it is a deeply erudite and complex history and analysis of one moment in the centuries-long process of the theft of the commons. The fixing of limits, as Ray Craib well knows, is a central operation of enclosure, arguably the most inclusive term for the denial of emancipation through the private appropriation of land and the extension of bureaucratic regimes of labor control. The power of fixation, he writes, fixations, plural, is their ability to disempower. It is their ability to rewrite the place of history as the space of legitimacy and to convert contingency into inevitability. And in that sentence, I think you get a very good sense of how Ray writes. That is, with clarity and complexity combined. And if I read that in a different way, you would hear the musicality of it, perhaps, which is a real pleasure in reading Ray. Ray's other concern in numerous essays and in The Cry of the Renegade, Subversive Santiago, 1920, which is forthcoming from Oxford, has been to detail various histories of libertarian socialist moments in the Americas. Part of that work will appear next spring in a volume titled No Gods, No Masters, No Peripheries, Global Anarchisms, a co-publication of the ICM and PM Press, an important anarchist press in Oakland. This volume collects extended versions of papers delivered at the 2012 ICM conference of the same name that Ray and I co-organized. Another part of his extensive labors, I'm not going to read all of this, don't worry. Another part of his extensive labors, and one that I particularly value, is his work on the politically radical Chilean poet Jose Domingo Gomez Rojas, whose murder while in prison Pablo Neruda compared to the later murder by fascists of the great Spanish poet Federico Garcia Lorca. They were enormities that could be weighed like this for Neruda. Throughout Ray's work, we find evidence of a conscientious historian who writes with clarity and purpose, whose imagination does not freeze when faced with poetry. For this, and a host of other reasons, let's welcome him today.
Okay, so just to make sure that people can hear, I guess I'm going to try this out, and if it sounds like a hockey game or something, then somebody take it off. Great, thank you. I want to thank the ICM for the invitation to speak, and it's really an honor, and I'm greatly appreciative, and I'm particularly appreciative to Barry's really lovely introduction, and we've had a long working relationship and friendship, and it's really nice and a good thing. Jose Domingo Gomez Rojas, the poet, is started off as the subject of the book that I'm currently finishing. It'll hopefully be out at the end of next year with Oxford. It started with a basic question: why and how did Jose Domingo Gomez Rojas, 24 years old, still a child, as his friend Manuel Rojas, who would become one of the great 20th century writers in Chilean letters and win the National Literary Prize in the 1950s. Still a child, Manuel Rojas said. The young hope of Chilean poetry, Neruda would recall. How did this 24-year-old poet end up in prison, then in an asylum briefly, and then in a cemetery? And the book is an effort to answer that question. It's not a biography of Gomez Rojas, although he figures prominently in its pages. It's really a book about the context in which his arrest, his imprisonment, and his death unfolds, and it's about the experiences of a number of the men he counted as friends, comrades, and colleagues. It covers a period of only 4 months, July through October of 1920, in Santiago, primarily in Santiago, Chile. I'll talk a little bit about why. And it's a book about anarchists and aristocrats, students and teachers, poets and prosecutors, cops and wobblies, and other assorted sorts of categories. One thing I'll say very quickly is Gomez Rojas has not been forgotten. He has been memorialized extensively. And so this is not a kind of exercise in historical recuperation or rescuing someone that has been forgotten or something like this. It's really an effort actually to cope with or come to terms with a historiographical fate that may be just as lonely, and that's martyrdom. He's remembered largely as a kind of martyr to the anarchist cause. But in the process of that, his life gets kind of stripped away, anarchism gets kind of stripped away and sort of made trans-historical. And the whole context and the people that were around him and were militant with him, agitated with him, wrote poetry with him, and so forth, they get lost in the equation. And some of these people's histories are remarkable and worthy of writing about in and of themselves, including this guy here, who I'll talk about in a minute, who my archival relationship with him was very powerful, I have to admit. There's a sort of transference effect that I tried to resist, but it was kind of difficult. Anyway, so I try to situate Gomez Rojas in his historical context. I try to expand beyond biography to allow others whose lives intertwined with his, who themselves were pursued and persecuted. I try to allow them to also determine the trajectory and character of historical facts, as Victor Serge wonderfully put it. Their individual stories open up on the collective reality of life in Santiago in the late 19-teens and the everyday forms of violence that persisted in that society: hunger, illness, dislocation, exploitation, poverty, police truncheons, and so forth. They also open up our understanding of repression in the state in the early 20th century, drawing it away from a story of individual tragedy and toward a more collective history of struggle and militancy. And their stories also serve as a reminder that Chile's history of illiberal politics and repression didn't start with Pinochet's coup in 1973. And in fact, one of the consequences, there is a relationship of cause and effect. One of the results, or what comes out of a lot of the agitation in 1919 and 1920 and 1921, is eventually the Constitution of 1925, which is very problematic in a variety of kinds of ways, but also has certain components to it that are very important. And Pinochet himself in 1973 would harken back to the Constitution of 1925 as the beginning of the end of it all, right? That was the beginning of the end for what the Chilean state should have looked like and should have been, and so forth. And we got to see what his vision of the state would look like very quickly. So I'm going to talk about these individuals around Gomez Rojas, and I'm going to talk about Gomez Rojas, and I get excited and I start to talk fast, and there's lots of things I want to talk about. But anyways, the book is organized in 4 chapters, all of them basically running from July 19th to October 1st, 1920. And then there's particular individuals that I take up in each chapter, and then I try to move back in time to deal with certain questions related to the history of anarchism, questions related to the history of university students. There were university students before 1968. I know that comes as a surprise sometimes. It's very important, more than the university reform movement in Argentina. And then there's also questions related to the social geography of Santiago that's of interest to me as well. I'm going to start with this individual here. That's wrong, it's not Ramos, it's Barrios, but many people would have known who he was, Casimiro Barrios Fernandez. He was expelled from Chile in July 19th of 1920. I want to tell you just a little bit about him. He was from La Rioja, the La Rioja region of Spain. He migrated to Chile as a young man. He was 14. He's 28 in this picture. He lived basically half his life and all of his adult life in Chile. That becomes important to the argument. He went to northern Chile, worked for his uncle for a little while, and then relocated to Santiago. And for some point after arriving there, around 1911 or 1912, he married a Chilean woman who had children from a previous marriage. She was a widow, and then they had more children together. Barrios lived in an area of the city known as the Barrio Latino. That's based, this is the sort of terms come from some of the literary works of Manuel Rojas and others. There's his residence, this is where he works, and what I've highlighted here are various things like the Woodworkers Union, the Industrial Workers of the World Center, the Print Shop of Newman, an anarchist and sociological publication, Café Los Inmortales, a cafe where Gomez Rojas and many of his friends, including Casimiro Barrios, would gather and read poetry and share their writings and talk politics. Zapateria Soviet, the Soviet shoe store, where the head of the Chilean Workers' Federation would in fact help put together and assemble and distribute different publications related to the struggle of the working class. The Socialist Workers' Party, Local, right here. All the blue spots are anarchists, the residences of anarchists who would be arrested in 1920 and detained indefinitely, some for 4, 5, 6 months in the latter half of 1920. But the point that I'm getting at is where Barrios lived made a difference to his politics. He may have chosen to move there because a lot of people were there. He may have had no choice where he lived because of the economy and nature of housing in Santiago at the time. So it's not about a relationship of cause and effect, but it's certainly about a relationship of where people live and who they encounter in the street in their daily lives and what their itineraries are like and so forth. And I'll come back to this also vis-a-vis where the elite lived as well. So this is Barrios's place, his location, and his life in part. I just want to back up to the other image I have here. If I can get that. In 1918, so Barrios first enters the archival record, as far as I've been able to tell, in 1918 when he is part of a series of demonstrations, over 100,000 people on the main thoroughfare of Santiago in November of 1918, as part of what was known as the National Workers' Assembly on Nutrition, basically protesting the continued export of basic food staples at a time when inflation and hunger were at a serious level of crisis. There have been constant efforts to sort of deal with the export of foodstuffs, whether or not there were going to be taxes on the importation of Argentine beef and so forth. And working people were especially suffering in 1917, 1918, and 1919 as World War I sort of came to an end. Casimiro Barrios, along with students from the university, the Student Federation, the Fetch, and also members of the Socialist Workers' Party, members of the Chilean Workers' Party, and others, all together, and also white-collar workers such as Barrios, he worked as a clerk in a store, came together and formed the National Workers' Assembly on Nutrition. Hunger, I mean, it's impossible to sort of exaggerate how significant hunger was to politics at the time. There were sayings, the sayings or phrases that were very much a part of everyday Chilean language. They are pigs who don't give lard. Right? To avoid breaking the shells, they don't eat eggs. Right? These are critiques. Right? These are critiques that use hunger and food as a mechanism to get in. Even tobacco could figure in here in terms of things like the moral economy of commodities. For not sharing a cigarette, they lose their tobacco pouch. Largely forgotten today, Maeterlinck's Nobel Prize winning play The Blue Bird, published in 1908, was a huge success, very popular among intellectuals at the time in Santiago, and it opens with a group of young creatures looking at another group of young creatures who aren't eating the food on their table, and they can't fathom the fact that they're not always hungry, and why aren't they eating the food now? Right? I mean, hunger is pervasive. Manuel Rojas' novels are everywhere about hunger. Vaso de Leche, classic short story that's still assigned to this day to students in primary school in Chile. As a result of these protests, all these here, these have to do with the exportation of food and so forth. As a result of these projects, the president at the time, Luis Sanfuentes, suspended exports. This upset, as you could imagine, many of the agriculturalists who populated the halls of the parliament. They saw their profit margins being cut into, and they moved relatively quickly, and on December 12th of 1918, they passed a residency law, akin to the laws that you could have seen passed in Argentina and elsewhere. The US had something like this, in which anybody who was perceived to be agitating against the social order would be either refused entrance into the country or would be expelled from the country. There have been repeated efforts to have a residency law put into place, and it's only after these events that, in fact, the Parliament is successful in putting those into place. The very first person ordered expelled under the residency law is Casimiro Barrios on December 18th of 1920. I'll show you just a very quick image here. This is the cover of a magazine that came out in very early January of 1919, so basically 2 weeks after Barrios is ordered expelled under the residency law. And it's a kind of image that's very typical of the way in which people like Barrios were written about and thought about as anarchists, and it's filled with the typical kind of stuff. This is Luis Sanfuentes, the president of Chile. There's the Chilean flag. He's the knight in shining armor. Here you have this kind of swarthy figure who's basically every possible amalgamation of Orientalist prejudice you can imagine. He's got a scimitar, he's got a pistol, he's got 2 bombs, he's swarthy, he's got a beard, he's got a ushanka, and just in case you're missing the reference even still, it says maximalismo or Bolshevism, maximalism across the top of this. This is the sort of vision of anarchism at the time, which is not surprising. The interesting thing is, by the time this came out, Barrios's expulsion order had been rescinded. And the reason it had been rescinded is that defenders were very strong, very vocal in defending Barrios. Members of the Socialist Workers' Party, also anarchists, also deputies in the parliament. One deputy in the parliament gave a long speech in defense of Barrios and said he's a constant sentinel for working men. Right? He knows labor law. He knows who distributes alcohol on Sundays when they shouldn't. He knows who doesn't pay on time effectively pays wages in cash rather than in chits and things like this. who doesn't give workers Sunday day of rest, who doesn't follow labor law. He organizes against certain kinds of distribution of alcohol systems and so forth. But the point was he's a constant sentinel. And this is, for me, something that was enormously important, and why I focus so closely on Santiago, is that Barrios is a wonderful example, I think, of people who sometimes don't get sort of theorized or thought through in the literature enough, especially around anarchism. For every Enrico Malatesta, for every peripatetic, transnational radical, there are 100 Casimiro Barrios. There are 150, 200, 250 people who are in a place, not necessarily mobile, but who know local labor law, who know who the parliamentarians are. They know who the good employers are, the bad employers are. They're the ones who do the grunt work of knocking on doors day in and day out. And I don't refer to them as local. I mean, the local sort of global dyad I don't like very much. So I refer to them as sedentary anarchists. I mean, they're not couch potatoes or lethargic lefties or something, but they're sedentary, and it's meant to be a provocation to think about people in place. And I also put the accent on sedentary because it's a very pragmatic and also epistemological solution to a problem, which is how do you write about anarchists who are long-term residents of a particular place or cluster of places, but for whom the ascription Chilean or domestic or foreign will not do, because they refuse those categories. They refuse those categories as inherently statist, as inherently nationalist, and both politically and epistemologically inadequate. And so part of what I do in the chapter is try to develop an argument around Barrios as a sedentary anarchist and try to peel back his local relationships and friendships and so forth. I'm not going to go into detail about it here, but I also try to wrestle with the derivation of some of the ideas that he and some of his comrades work with to get out of, as Shelley was mentioning at the outset, the notion of diffusion, and that anarchist ideas come exclusively from post-1860 Europe and sort of diffuse outward. Instead, there's a much more interesting relationship at work, not that ideas are autochthonous to Chile or autochthonous to someplace else, but there's a much more kind of interesting circulation at work, and ideas are effectively undocumented, for lack of a better word. Barrios is not expelled. Right? The government, essentially at a certain point in very late 1918, goes to the parliament, explains its decision, and says, we're not going to expel him for a host of reasons, but one of the reasons that I want to mention here that's very important is because he was married to a Chilean woman with Chilean children. And there is a tension within the government around a commitment to the sort of bourgeois institution of marriage and family, and this kind of effort to expel people and get them out of the country who they don't want. So he's not expelled in 1918. He is expelled in 1920 on July 19th. And I'll tell you a little bit more about why he's expelled in July of 1920 by shifting now to a couple of other people that I want to talk about. Barrios is taken to the border on July 19th of 1920 with Peru. He's expelled across the river, the Sama River, into Peru. At the very same time, in Santiago, that very same evening on July 19th, 10 o'clock at night, let's see there, 400 students from the Catholic University in Chile, referring to themselves as patriots, come looking for the head of this man, Juan Gandulfo. And they come bearing what was known as the Mirada Milagrosa, the miraculous gaze brought on by too much whiskey. 400, including one who vomits onto the piano in the student club and then wipes his face with the Chilean flag. Okay, like a good patriot. So 400 patriots come looking for the head of Juan Gandulfo, and they come looking at the Chilean Student Federation Club, right downtown in central Santiago. They come looking for Gandulfo because he is the vice president of the Student Federation, the Fetch. I'll refer to it as the Fetch from here on out. And the Fetch had recently critiqued government mobilizations on the Peruvian border. The context here is very important. In June of 1920, there were to be the first round of elections for the next president in Chile. And there was a kind of upstart candidate known as Arturo Alessandri. And Alessandri had assembled a kind of following that had the traditional oligarchs of the parliament concerned. And so the elections were sort of up in the air. It was uncertain what was going to happen. There was also an enormous economic upheaval that got increasingly worse over the course of 1920, such that by May and June of 1920, you have 300, 400, 500 people a day coming into Santiago from the north because they've been put out of work by the closing of nitrate mines and nitrate operations in the north, trying to figure out where to house people, how to employ people, and so forth. Had become a major issue for a government already trying to deal with the consequences of industrialization, the whole gamut of things known as the social question, infant mortality, alcoholism, lack of housing, disease, and so forth. And there was also a coup in Bolivia in which the claim was made that the Peruvians had been part of this coup and that it was an effort, in fact, for a first part of an effort in part for Peru to take back portions of the north of Chile, which they had lost in the War of the Pacific. That wasn't necessarily the case, but these were things that were circulated at the time. But there was a Bolivian coup. This is the context in which the government mobilizes troops on the Peruvian border. In June of 1920, the fetch meets, Juan Gandulfo and others are there, and they ask the government for an explanation, and they critique the way in which the government has approached the question of its relationship with Peru, long-standing antagonism and conflict, and so forth. This is why people come looking, young students from the Catholic University come looking for Gandulfo. The fetch itself is very interesting. It started in 1906 in very combative circumstances, responding to a kind of snub directed at students who had been working hard in Valparaiso with the consequences of both an earthquake and a set of health crises that developed in Valparaiso, and then they were snubbed at the reception that was basically put together in their honor. By 1917, the fetch is populated with a much stronger anarchist and sort of anarcho-communist influenced leadership, including Gandulfo himself, also Santiago Labarca, who would go on to become prominent in Chilean politics throughout much of the 20th century. The fetch is also influenced, by 1917, its politics are being influenced by inflation, by economic crises, by the constant speculation of money, by elites within the country, by the issues that are being addressed by the National Workers' Assembly on nutrition, and they're also being shaped and influenced by the Russian Revolution. Many of the students who were writing in the fetch at the time were adopting pen names like Pravda, Ivan, Pablo Neruda, who would show up in 1921, 6 months after Gómez Rojas dies, adopts the name Sachka Yegulev from one of the novels of Leonid Andreev at the time. Right. So all of these kinds of questions are things that are on the mind of the fetch. Students are coming from a variety of places. The university is expanding in 1917, 1918, 1919. It goes basically from about 1,000 students at the early part of the 20th century to almost 4,000 by 1918. You have students from increasingly from provincial backgrounds and from what you could call more or less middle-class backgrounds attending the university. They're living in pensions. They're living in boarding houses in the very areas that I just showed you where Casimiro Barrios was living, for example, amongst others. But that means they're living in parts of the town where they're interacting and spending time with and reading poetry with people who are workers and worker intellectuals and artisans and so forth. And this shapes their politics quite dramatically. So the social and physical structure of Santiago confirmed a lot of the things that they were reading in the texts that were circulating at the time. Here's another picture of Gandulfo. This is upon release of one of his many times in jail. But I just want to show you this, Trotsky, right? The world will be maximalist or it will perish. This is a little card that was distributed encouraging people at the price of 2 pesos to buy the latest translation of one of Trotsky's works. So students who identify as anarchist are reading Trotsky, they're reading Kropotkin, they're reading Oswald Spengler, a Prussian reactionary. They're reading lots of people in very interesting kinds of ways. And they're taking what they read and they're applying it to the surroundings that they find themselves in. and they're not liking what they see, and the fetch is becoming increasingly radicalized in particular kinds of ways. Just to take a very obvious example of something that happens in the city in 1919, this is a period of rampant hunger, it's a period in which there's a typhus epidemic, it's a period in which there's a housing crisis. On average, 30 children under the age of 1 died per day in the winter of 1919 in Santiago. At the time that is happening, Santiago and its inhabitants are watching the elite prepare to occupy the city's first modern skyscraper, complete with a luxury restaurant on the first floor and built at the cost of some 3.5 million US dollars. Truffles for some, tuberculosis for others. That's what you call conspicuous consumption. Okay, so the university is expanding, students are becoming more radicalized. I want to talk a little bit about them as middle-class students. It's important to recognize the middle class in 1918, 1920. These are people who rarely lived in terms of physical proximity or financial precarity far from the working class. Right? Middle class itself, people, school teachers, journalists, shopkeepers and clerks, public employees, lived a tenuous existence of what one person at the time described as genteel poverty. And they were constantly struggling with meager incomes and rampant inflation. And I stress this because there's a frequency within which both commentators at the time, but also commentators to this day, have a kind of snarky approach to students as being sort of middle class, and they can always grow out of their politics, and they can sort of choose their career paths later, and they'll be incorporated into the establishment and so forth. This is the argument made quite strongly by Gabriel Salazar, great Chilean Marxist intellectual, but has mostly disdain for anybody who's not radically marginal. Anyways, I want to recuperate a little bit more political optimism. So they lived in pensiones and working class neighborhoods, as I mentioned, and out of this, students in the Fetch began to frequent working men's clubs. They began to spend time in the offices of the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW. They created night schools, offering a variety of different kinds of classes. They also created free medical clinics. Juan Gandolfo was at the forefront of that, in fact. And they made common cause with workers. Even if at times it was a very uneasy and difficult relationship, it was a working, intense relationship that they forged. Right? And it's enormously important. And part of what comes out of this is that the Fetch club, the actual physical presence, the physical club of the Fetch, which had a little cantina, had a billiards table, had a bar. You could get your hair cut there. There was a barber. You could take boxing classes. If you had a little card from the Fetch, if you remember the Fetch, you got discounts at local bookstores that sold all the latest sociology and history and literature and so forth. The Fetch's space became a location for working class organizations' meetings, oftentimes initially to avoid police infiltrators who had figured out where the other meetings were going to be. And so there's a little game of cat and mouse that would happen at times. So the National Workers' Assembly on Nutrition would hold their meetings at the offices of the Fetch. Workers who were striking against the department store known as Gathi Chavez, which is a major department store, first department store in Santiago to have an elevator, 4 stories high. You go to the top floor and have coffee and take the elevator. The workers that were striking against Gathi Chavez used the Fetch Club for their meetings as well. And there are other cases of this that I could point to also. But the essential point is that the Fetch had become, by 1919, much more than a student federation. To put this another way, the leadership of the Fetch had expanded what it meant to be a student. They had expanded what the role of the Fetch could and should be in Santiago society. They had expanded the idea of who could engage in politics, and they tried to reshift the idea of politics itself. So spaces like the Fetch Club, as well as the streets of Santiago, became places where students and workers together inhabited and appropriated these spaces, and they made them their own. This is not to suggest they forged these kind of perfectly egalitarian configurations, but just to stress that such political and social solidarity was possible, and it was real, and it was happening. And this, in part, explains the vehemence with which the aristocrats or Chile's oligarchs will come down on the student federation, in fact. There's a kind of notion of students being out of place, right, of kind of breaching a certain kind of social configuration. So on the 19th of July, they come after Juan Gandulfo. I'm sorry you can't see this very well, but this is a crowd of about 3,000 people on July 21st, assaulting the physical premises of the fetch, looking for Juan Gandulfo again, who by this time has gone into hiding, and instead they find his brother Pedro Gandulfo. I interviewed Pedro's son, who's been in exile most of his life, and this is another thing I won't go into today, but the afterlife of this is very important, and the continuities within families politically is extremely important, and something that figures in the epilogue of the book. But 3,000 people who had just come from a march sending troops off, reservists to the north to the Peruvian front, or the front with Peru, then descend on the offices right downtown in central Santiago, descend on the offices of the fetch. And this is what they do. Right, this is Pedro Gandulfo, Juan's brother. They burn the library. You can see here police officers in the crowd, right, standing and watching. Right? They burn the library, they burn the entire run of Juventud, the youth magazine, at the time very prominent, very important one, run by a man who would become a very important part of Chilean literary and political life, Roberto Mesa Fuentes. They do other things. This is interesting. This is the plancha. These are the planchas that were in front of the fetch on the wall. These are the bronze plaques that say Federación de Estudiantes de Chile, de la Universidad de Chile. So they pulled them down and pried them off with a crowbar and sort of paraded them through the streets, and then went to El Mercurio, the major newspaper at the time, and had their photograph taken. They regretted it later because when some insistence, well, I can't get that, there it is. When some insistence was made that they be pursued for what they did, they then began to get identified by the police. And so the numbers up here are numbers that refer to this, which is on the back side of the picture, which is the names of the people who could be identified as having taken the plaque down and marched it around. Very interesting thing here, which is just a nice little aside. It's kind of interesting. Emilio Kartulovich, number 7. Let me see if I can just show you who he is. There he is. Emilio Kartulovich would go on from this event and become a very famous race car driver in Argentina, and he would be one of the first individuals to solo race a car back and forth across the Andes between Santiago and Buenos Aires. The other thing he would do is in 1934 he'd become the lover of a woman whose name is probably familiar to you, which is Eva Perón. He would become Eva Perón's young lover before she becomes Eva Perón. Anyways, but there he is. Okay. So the second assault on the fetch in 1921 is a destruction. The fetch is destroyed. The billiards table is completely destroyed. The kitchen is destroyed. Pedro Gandulfo is arrested. Other people who were in the club at the time, who are members of the fetch, are also arrested. And they are held, and they will be held for about 80 days in custody. Pedro Gandulfo will contract tuberculosis, as most people do in prison. This is important again because, again, there's a kind of sense in which students in some ways are privileged and maybe don't take their politics quite so seriously, but in fact they knew if they ended up in the jail, they were going to get tuberculosis, and tuberculosis could be a death sentence. And in fact, Pedro Gandulfo's son told me that his father, as he aged, was very clear about what tuberculosis had done to his body and to his health. After the assault on the fetch, that day, on the 21st of July, 10 p.m. that night, some other things happened. A group of young men celebrating the assaults on the fetch marched around the Plaza de Armas, just up the street, forcing people that they perceived to be not patriots or perhaps defenders of the fetch to kiss the flag. In the process of that happening, there was a struggle, and a young man named Julio Covarrubias was shot and killed. He was a young man from a fairly prominent political family. It was unclear exactly what had happened, but Chile's well-to-do were appalled. They were particularly appalled that such violence had happened in what they called our part of the city, the heart of the city. And just to give you a little bit of a sense of what their experience was with the city, there's a great book by China Mieville called The City in the City, and this is always what this makes me think of. It's like two cities laying on top of each other that are completely distinct. But things are changing in 1920. You have cinemas, which are bringing people out in the streets and mixing in different ways in terms of social class, in ways that they didn't necessarily before. The theater, like theaters for young people without a lot of money or working people, were often in distinct parts of town, but the cinemas are all downtown. People are going to the cinemas together. Cars. There's about 30 cars in Santiago in 1914. There's about 3,000 cars, mostly Hudsons, in 1920. You have to deal with these things circulating in the streets, competing with trams, and so on and so forth. Department stores are being built in skyscraper. Right? There's a whole different kind of architecture that's developing over time. Electric tram lines and double-decker trams. Very important because now, let me just show you an image of the tram lines. The electric tram lines are the dark highlighted ones here, and also the ones here. And then there's a few dotted ones which are still ones that are pulled by animal powered. But electric tram lines mean an expansion very quickly of the tram system and an expansion in terms of people's possibilities of mobility throughout the city. So now you're getting working people who are moving constantly around the city much more efficiently, much more quickly. They have access to parts of the city in ways that they didn't before. And so the very lifeblood of liberal politics and liberal economies, which is circulation, now is sort of frustrating because things like the red flu of Bolshevism is going to circulate, or the black plague of anarchism, right? All of a sudden now these things are going to circulate too. And these things are also going to circulate in a radically growing print culture, right? Publishing is undergoing a significant transformation in the early part of the 20th century in which you can really publish extensively in a way that you couldn't necessarily before. The caption to this, which I haven't included here, says, vagabond radicals. The first thing they do is look for news about Bolshevik Russia. Right? I mean, so the idea here being that people seen as sort of idle public on the streets reading are clearly plotting and scheming a sort of overthrow of traditional society. So there's the killing of Covarrubias on July 21st, but in conjunction with issues around print culture and electric tram lines and mobility, there's another assault that takes place in Santiago, and that is an assault by a small group of young men, again, who refer to themselves in police records as patriots and so forth, an assault on the print shop of Julio Valiente. Valiente was a long-time anarchist and radical. He'd agitated in the north. Most of his life had been spent in Santiago. And one of the things that he'd done is created, along with Santiago Labarca, a student, right? The two of them together had bought the Newman print shop and produced a journal called Newman, which was wonderfully eclectic with reviews, book reviews, and stuff related to theater and humor, political stuff, translations, and so forth. But one of the things that he had printed in Newman were the statutes of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. And in the process of investigating the assault on the print shop of Newman, officials pick up on the IWW and anarchism as a kind of way to begin to intervene in politics that they don't like, the things that are happening that they don't want to see happening, and related to the questions of the political elections and the kinds of protests that are developing in the streets, the behavior of the fetch, and so on and so forth. Valiente is arrested on the 19th. It's his print shop that was attacked, but he's arrested. He won't be out again until January of 1921. The person put in charge to oversee the prosecution of people perceived to be subversives, anarchists, or members of the IWW is this man, Jose Astorquiza Líbano. Astorquiza is a very interesting figure. El Clinic, which is this very sarcastic, wonderful publication contemporarily now in Chile, did a list recently of the 20th biggest, I guess the best translation is motherfuckers in Chilean history. And Astorquiza made the top, he didn't make the top of the list, he made the list, as did another guy I'm going to talk about in a little while, Ventura Maturana, who headed the security police in the 1920s. The two of them made the list. The problem is, of course, is that there's a sort of Old Testament narrative about this kind of stuff, right? So Jose Domingo Gomez Rojas and his companions are Jesus, and Astor Pisa's Pontius Pilate or Satan or something. And in fact, he's a pretty interesting guy, in part because he himself was an unfree man. He had incurred a significant amount of debt. He was basically trying as hard as he could to climb the social ladder in Santiago's legal and political and social life, and he had incurred a significant amount of debt to purchase some land outside of Santiago, and he was in arrears. He was having a hard time making the payment. He was appointed with a kind of quid pro quo that he would bring the hammer down quite hard on the students in the fetch, anybody perceived to be affiliated with the IWW, and so forth. He takes up the position as special prosecutor, and he moves on July 25th to carry out the first first wave of detentions that will take place. Anybody who was perceived to be a member of the IWW, their residence was raided, they were arrested, different kinds of materials were collected to kind of prove sedition or illicit association. Those were considered to be the two crimes. It was not illegal to be in the IWW, and it was not illegal to have an IWW until July 22nd of 1920. It was not a proscribed organization prior to that moment. Frank Brissonen's book, which was a big defense of the, not a big defense, but a defense of the persecution of the IWW in the United States, was actually used as a rationale, further rationale to persecute the IWW in Santiago, in a very interesting use of the book by one of the senators. So they look for stuff like this. This is Consejo Regional Administrativo, Administrative Regional Council for the Industrial Workers of the World. 15 July 1920, Jose Rojas Marin, I have a lot of stuff on him. And then signed by Manuel Silva, for example, one of the people who would be arrested amongst others. Another person arrested is Jose Domingo Gomez Rojas, poet, student, but also the Secretary General of the Santiago branch of the IWW at the time. As a result of the arrests on the 25th and the assaults on the Fetch, and the Fetch has its juridical status revoked by the government, students and workers together call for a general strike on the 26th, on Monday the 26th. And from the 26th to the 30th of July, there are running street battles and protests in downtown Santiago. There are multiple arrests, 160 people more or less, as far as I've been able to count thus far, are detained. Everyone is detained for sedition until any kind of investigation by the security section can prove that they were not guilty of sedition in some form. If no evidence was found of sedition, such as the bulletines or anything kind of counted, if you were reading different kinds of material and so forth, that counted as somehow sympathy with the movement, or even worse, membership in the movement. Only after that fact would then your penalty be reduced to public disorderliness. The strange thing about this project is it took me a long time to find the police interrogations, because they're not housed in the criminal records where I thought I would find them for prosecuting people for sedition, because a lot of them are housed in what eventually became determined to be public disorderliness. But then if you go through them, you actually find people have been held on for 40, 50, 60 days on accusations of sedition. Okay, so a lot of people are arrested, and the nature of the events in Santiago at the time, as well as the words people said. Did they say "Viva Alessandri"? Did they say "Kill the cops"? Did they say "Infiltrate the military"? These are contested, right? And people go back and forth over this, and the police have one version of events, and those arrested have another version of events. The problem for the police is that nobody, including the deputies in the parliament and some of the senators, believe them. The police have a terrible reputation at the time. They've been involved in repeated scandals. They've been caught repeatedly planting bombs and trying to frame anarchists. For any of you reading the news, you know that yesterday a bomb went off in the Santiago metro. Bachelet is already talking about the anti-terrorism law and anarchists and Mapuche activists and so forth. Well, we'll see, but it sounds quite familiar. But there's a lot of scandals with the police planting bombs. And there's also an effort to, in fact, build upon certain kinds of stereotypical ideas about anarchists and so forth. There's other things, I mean, silly things that would be humorous if they weren't so appalling. A doctor who was one of Juan Gandolfo's teachers, Dr. Noé, very important in medical science and Chilean medical history, was discussing the need to, in fact, figure out ways to deal with a fairly rapidly growing stray dog problem in Santiago. And so the police said that they'd come up with a plan that basically the thing to do was to execute the dogs, to kill the dogs, but the police couldn't do it because already people throughout Santiago didn't like them, and that if they did that, this would just further the sort of atavistic hatred, as they put it, that the population has for the police. So the police suggested putting together a local committee of well-to-do people and having them poison the dogs after midnight. So there's all kinds of things about the police that are like, that come up in the documents repeatedly, and they're not considered trustworthy. Over the course of the 19-teens, there's an effort to, in fact, change this, and the effort that's made is to militarize the police, which is to mean, not to give them body armor and Homeland Security grants, but to give, to actually structure them in military fashion, to take ex-military personnel and have them come into the police force. And so you get very interesting things. You get a guy who comes in and reorganizes the police force, who came from a military background, and actually advocates for and wins a whole lot of kind of social benefits, welfare things for the police, which is quite interesting. But then he also does a variety of other things that actually, in effect, really does militarize the police force in various ways. When asked how he accomplished this, his name was Rafael Toledo Tagle. When asked how he accomplished it, he decided to paraphrase Louis XIV and said, "I am the police." And he had a sort of great statement about his overarching power. And of course, it's ironic because state and police are sort of redundant for many of the anarchists at the time. And so they saw in Toledo Tagle's comment further affirmation of why they should be suspicious and why the public should be suspicious. Police at the time meant not only nightsticks and raids and arrests and so forth, it also meant the broader institutions that existed to sustain the social order known as the state. It meant things like residency laws, expulsion decrees, labor laws, forms of method of identification, registration, population control, and so forth. And I just want to talk a little bit about registration. I promised in my little snippet about advertising this talk that you get to meet a man with X-ray eyes. So here's the man with X-ray eyes. His name is Tomás López Martín, and he had inherited from his parents, he claimed, a special ability. He had X-ray eyes. He said he could see people, quote, as if they were nude, and he could discern the condition of their internal organs. He had been doing this in Valparaiso for quite some time with a steady stream of clients until some point in 1918 he was arrested, and he moved to Santiago where he began anew, and he was doing quite well again. And then he unfortunately tried to divin the state of the organs of a security section agent by the name of Miguel Steuven. Lopez said to him, "I see your esophagus is a little black, but that is due to nicotine. Your aorta is working fine. The bladder and the rectum are mildly inflamed due to some illnesses that you've had recently." Steuven and his partner, Ventura Maturana, organized the sting and arrested Lopez. I just want to show you. This is Ventura Maturana. He was the other guy who made the list with Astor Pisa in the Clinic newspaper. Maturana and Steuven were part of a security section that was attempting to revamp the identification and registration sections of the police force. There was a huge effort in the early part of the 20th century to figure out how to identify people and to register them. So there was a lot of efforts to register foreigners. Peruvians were at the top of the list because they were always considered suspicious. Then next came Russians, and then came Spaniards, and so forth. And there were these efforts to create registries and rolls and lists and so forth. But there were also efforts to identify people in ways so that they could deal with questions of recidivism and crime and criminality and so forth. Photography, right? So this has been doing another. Photography is one example. There were issues with photography, of course. It's always difficult, for sure, to use photography as a means to identify people. This is the famous IWW in Valparaiso. Juan Onofre Chamorro, one of the founders of the IWW, coming out of court, and the little snippet here says, here's Chamorro trying to make different kinds of gestures with his face to throw off his physiognomy so he won't be photographed. And in fact, it's not a stretch. Chamorro organized protests in 1917 amongst dock workers to actually overturn a requirement that you be photographed and have a photograph on your worker ID card, precisely because of the dangers of photography from perspectives of working people. Victor Surge, if you've read Victor Surge and his time in prison, great book, Men in Prison, talks about how prisoners would teach one another how to basically modify their face when it was being photographed in ways that weren't immediately recognizable to prison guards and other people taking photographs at the time. So photography was one issue, but it was something that it was not seen as a kind of reliable technology. There was anthropometry, measurement of facial features, the length of the right earlobe. They have these index cards. What's the size of the nose? Medium, small, or large? I mean, it's a sort of interesting thing that they're so vague, but by the same token, there's this idea that somehow measurement can, in certain ways, help with identification. And also dactyloscopy, the effort to find a new system of classification for fingerprints. So it's not necessarily about how you fingerprint, it's about the ways in which the system of classification of fingerprints can help you rapidly kind of work through identification files that you may have on hand. It's a constant game of cat and mouse because for every technology that the state tries to come up with and the police try to come up with, working people and others are constantly trying to kind of find ways to kind of work around it, whether it's X-ray eyes and a sort of little scan, or whether it's trying to deal with differentiating your facial features and so forth. The problem is this, what I want to stress is basically, and why I talk about the guy with the X-ray eyes, is because methods of identification and registration were also subject to police manipulation. And there's a certain kind of metaphysics in police practice at the time. So the man with the X-ray eyes claims to see his clients' interiors to prey on their fears and their wallets, but the police themselves are prone to their own fabrications, as we've seen already in their reports, in their claims, in their testimony, in the fact that they're planting bombs and trying to set up anarchists, and so forth. They also are dealing with fictions. They're creating fictional individuals, typical individuals, right? Composite or statistical individuals. That's a fiction, right? It may be a social science fiction, but it's a fiction. Bertillon, who developed some of the practices that I'm talking about here, had what he called the verbal portrait system, which was totally assailed as a failed mix of science and spiritism. And his anthropometric system was increasingly seen as unreliable and cumbersome. There's all kinds of dubious metaphysical assumptions in police work. Things like, the most obvious one being physiognomy and facial morphology can somehow be predictors of criminal tendencies, such that somehow the surface of somebody's body will basically evidence what their inner self or inner character is like. Right? So in an ironic twist, criminologists, detectives, and theorists of crime and the social body think that they can make your interior state visible and governable, right? In which case, Maturana and the other security section agents have much more in common with the man with the X-ray eyes than they wanted to admit. And of course, fittingly enough, they work for the Ministry of the Interior. Astorquisa, right, he's trying to deal with the police force. And by late July of 1920, he's got 160 people, more or less, detained. And by early August, he starts to ratchet things up further and begins to arrest a whole array of people associated with the labor movement with very flimsy cause. And the reason I just mentioned this is for two cartoons I wanted to show you. The press, which had been incredibly pro-government, pro-police and all of this, and enormously critical of anything that smacked of anarchism, the IWA and so forth, begins by late August to feel as if Astorquisa is sort of overstepping his bounds. So here's one example. Poor Mr. Inocencio Walton Walker, right? Very wonderfully Chilean British name. Inocencio Walton Walker, unfortunately, has been detained because all of his clothes have his initials in them, IWW. And the other one is, they turned Astorquisa's name into a noun, Astorquisism. And basically, he's in this guy here is coming off the street, and he's in a beauty parlor, and the guy says, "Servicio completo," you want the works, right? And he says, "Whatever you want. The main thing is that when I'm on the street, they don't take me for an anarchist, and then Astor is going to take me prisoner." So you're getting these, the beginnings of a kind of critical response to some of the activities of Astor. Okay, I'm going to finish up now a little bit and get us to José Domingo Gómez Rojas. So by now we're in August and September. As I mentioned, about 160 men by this point have been detained. 2 women have been detained as well. Both of them not for purported membership in the IWW, both of them for throwing rocks at the police, or purportedly throwing rocks at the police during one of the street battles in late July in Santiago. All of these people are held indefinitely. They know the law very well. They have attorneys working for them who also know the law very well, and they will petition for bail, and they will say, "You cannot hold me without bail on the charges of public disorderliness." And Astor will always respond, "No al lugar," right? There's no justification to release them right now. No, continue to hold them. And so they're processed in the detention center of the security section and held in the public jail. Public jail had about 640 cells at the time, and had a small area that was devoted to holding people incommunicado, in isolation. But eventually, the jail is overrun because of the number of people that they're rounding up and holding and detaining, and they begin to move people to the penitentiary, especially to Gallery 12. This is a picture in Gallery 12. It's right off of the Siberian patio, which over the course of much of the 20th century will become the patio where executions are held at the penitentiary. And it's interesting that it's called the Siberian patio. So these are a number of the men who were detained for being members of the IWW or seen as anarcho-syndicalists. That's José Domingo Gómez Rojas. That's Pedro Gandulfo, Juan's brother. Juan is still on the run at this point when this photograph's taken. And that's Julio Valiente. It's the only picture we have, to the best of my knowledge, of Julio Valiente. There's a couple of other individuals here, Roberto Salinas, who would go on to form the Socialist Party in the early 1930s with a couple of other people in Chile. And the other people I've yet been able to definitively identify. But they're placed here due to overcrowding. Gómez Rojas, I'll just say a few things about him. He's born in 1896, so he's 24. In fact, he spends his 24th birthday in the jail, and then is moved to the penitentiary. But he spends his 24th birthday in the jail. At the age of 17, in 1913, he published a collection of poetry called Lyrical Rebellions. I just want to read you a tiny little excerpt of the poem. There's a poem called Renegación, or I've translated it as Cry of the Renegade. I, child of the century of two-faced swine. I mean, that's the great one. I, child of the century of two-faced swine, forsake my century and embrace the fight, with roars of menace and cries of rebellion. And my songs are red like dynamite, like my pains, like my endless anguish, like my eternal thirst for eternal redemption. So it's a much longer poem, but it's very vivid language. There's a lot of kind of biblical language in his poetry. He's actually a kind of dissident Protestant. He's this kind of he's got these mystical components to him, and oftentimes his religiosity is sort of overshadowed by people's emphasis of his anarchist politics. He's a student at the university in the School of Pedagogy. He's a poet. He has enormous influence on some of the great writers in Chilean letters over the course of the 20th century. Not only Neruda, but Manuel Rojas, José Santos González Vera, amongst others. He's a bureaucrat in a government ministry. He's working in a government ministry for a while. And he's also, as I mentioned, the secretary of the Industrial Workers of the World as well. And then he's got these kinds of components to him where he's engaged in anarchist politics, but also has this kind of very strong religious component to his work. And there's a lot about social and individual transcendence in his work that's very interesting to me. The work is very, I tried to spend some time working on his poetry. You get very interesting things in his work. For a long time, the figure that would often appear in a lot of poetry at the time was the swan. Right? And instead, with Gómez Rojas, you get the condor, right? Clawed, predatory, savage. The poetry is often, it's almost like a proclama, like a manifesto, right? It kind of harangues the reader and the listener, and it resembles at times the kinds of things that people, workers and agitators and students would hand out to pedestrians on the streets of Santiago. One reviewer at the time summarized his work as follows. José Domingo Gómez Rojas is still very young. Even so, he is already a rebel, a terrible rebel, a frightening rebel. He is rebelling against everything, against grammar, against literature, against poetry, against society, against civilization. It is a lot of rebellion for one lone youth. He writes extensively through the 19 teens. He's arrested, as I mentioned, in July 25th of 1920. He's initially put in the penitentiary with his comrades and friends in Gallery 12. Life was in no way easy in the penitentiary, but it was certainly preferable to be in the penitentiary to the jail. In the penitentiary, you got time on the patio, you got sunlight, you could actually cook on the patio if people brought you your own food. In the jail, that was not allowed. Most of the cells were actually half sunk down underground. They were damp. Tuberculosis was a much bigger problem in the jail than it was in the penitentiary. And José Domingo Gómez Rojas is sent back to the jail by Astorquiza. There's a very famous exchange between Astorquiza and Gómez Rojas in which Astorquiza says to him, "Are you an anarchist?" And Gómez Rojas says, "I don't merit such a designation," right? In the sense that I'm not worthy of being considered an anarchist. Astorquiza says, "Do you have no clue how serious the charges are against you here, against the internal security of the state?" And Gómez Rojas says, "Let's not play theater," right? Sort of shrugs his shoulders. And Astorquiza gets extraordinarily angry and orders him manacled on a diet of bread and water only and sent back from the penitentiary to the jail. And that's where, in fact, Gómez Rojas will stay for the remainder, almost the remainder of his life. That exchange is really interesting to me, in part because of things like this. Subversivo, right? Subversive. ¿Cree usted en el queso de la bola? Right? And this is the judge, and you can see that this is a sort of Oscar Wilde figure. Oscar Wilde is enormously important to the anarchist intellectuals at the time. There's a whole slew of anarchist thinkers and writers and intellectuals, and many who are not anarchists, who are people that they want to emulate in various kinds of ways, who are seen as incredibly inspirational, in part because of their insolence, right? Or what those in power will call insolence. It's their willingness to be defiant, even under circumstances where the power situation is pretty intense. So you think about Félix Fénéon, the anarchist Félix Fénéon, who with very dry wit had the public and the jury laughing at the prosecutor in his trial for throwing a bomb in Paris. There's the young radical Bogolyubov in Russia, who refused to show General Trepov the proper respect, and so Trepov had him publicly beaten. And that beating provoked not only public outrage, but in fact an avenging spirit in the form of Vera Sasulic, who attempted to assassinate Trepov for beating the young man publicly. Or Casimiro Barrios. When Casimiro Barrios is brought in July and expelled, part of the accusation directed at him explicitly in the documents is he was insolent. Right? So there's a politics to insolence that's very interesting to me that I'm trying to work out in this last chapter now. It's the last chapter that I'm trying to finish. So this shows up in the newspaper in late August, right, after this exchange between Astorquiza and José Domingo Gómez Rojas. The intellectuals of Gómez Rojas' own generation would talk about the fact that that this exchange and this effort to emulate Oscar Wilde and to be defiant in the face of it all cost him his life. José Santos González Vera, a very astute observer of life under hierarchy and inequality, wasn't trying to elide the role of political opposition and radicalism at the time, but he also emphasized things like social graces as crucial to understand in politics, and in fact talks about the ways in which Gómez Rojas was intensely persecuted precisely for his unwillingness to submit. So Gómez Rojas is returned to jail. He stays there throughout the month of September, and his condition deteriorates. He's held alone in a cell It's eventually determined that he had meningitis, but for many of the students at the time and for many of those who participated in his funeral was an enormous event. 40,000 people took to the streets to follow the funeral cortege, which actually retraced some of the signal events. Right? If you follow on a map the funeral cortege, it follows some of or touches on some of the signal places in the proceso de los subversivos, in the prosecutions, in the events that happened in July and August and September, and then it ends up at the cemetery where Gómez Rojas is interred. And just one last thing I want to say, which is what happens to some of the other individuals in the book. Barrios is expelled. He makes his way to Callao in Peru. He's organizing workers in Callao. He sneaks back into the country in 1921, as you would expect him to. It's his home. That's where his family is. That's his home. It has nothing to do with him wanting to be Chilean or anything. This is not a Chilean history. Right? This is a history of Santiago for a reason. It shouldn't be nationalized. It's a history that should be anarchized. Barrios is then expelled in 1927 for being a communist rather than an anarchist. And in fact, he might have agreed with the designation, or he may not have even cared. But his son, who was born in 1925, was named Santiago Lenin Barrios. He's expelled, he goes to Bolivia, where he hooks up with anarchists. And he organizes with anarchists in Bolivia. And in fact, his name appears in one of the great 20th century books on the Bolivian labor movement, Yoda's history of the Bolivian labor movement. He declares war to the death to the dictator Ibáñez, who was at the time in power in Chile. He crosses the border in the north. He's detained by 3 carabineros under the orders of this man, Ventura Maturana, the man who arrested the man with the X-ray eyes and ran the security section. And on Maturana's orders, Casimiro Barrios is executed in the Valle of Azapa. Juan Gandulfo goes on to create an IWW clinic in Santiago, and he becomes an engraver for Neruda's writings. So the first edition of Crepusculario by Neruda is in fact dedicated to Juan Gandulfo, and he did the engravings for that. He also became one of the most well-respected surgeons working in Santiago in the 1920s and died in a car accident in 1931 on his way to Valparaiso. Pedro Gandulfo, his brother, was not allowed to continue his studies in the university to study law. He was not allowed to become a lawyer because he had been arrested and detained for sedition, although never found guilty. So he went on to become a dentist. One of his patients in the 1940s turned out to be the mother of one of the guys who assaulted him in the attack on the Fetch in 1920. And there's an interesting story behind that as well. Julio Valiente, very quickly, the printer, Valiente stayed in Santiago and became a clerk in a real estate office and actually wrote his memoirs at the request of Marcelo Segal, who's a very important Chilean Marxist historian who worked with the revolutionary movement of the left in the 1950s and 1960s, was imprisoned and tortured by the Pinochet regime along with his students. Most of his students died with him in prison. He survived and was exiled to Amsterdam, and he took all of his clippings with him. A lot of the stuff I have here comes from Segal's folders. It's a heartbreaking story, to be honest. But he asked Valiente to write his memoirs, and there's about 15 pages. Valiente didn't get very far and got lost or something. And then the last thing, Astor Quizá. Astor Quizá, after the death of Gómez Rojas, his wife goes insane and ends up in the Casa de Orates, the asylum where Gómez Rojas himself had ended up. And Astor Quizá, over the course of the 1920s, holds various positions in the court system, but essentially everything begins to unravel for him over the course of the 1920s. And I'll stop there because I've held you up for a long time, and say thanks for listening to the project.
Take questions.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer questions. Yeah.
The floor is open for questions.
Holly, yes.
This was really interesting. Thank you so much. One of the things that struck me about the images, and it might be a coincidence, is that it seems as though they didn't self-fashion as anarchists. Is that because they were trying to give themselves a different image to avoid the image of anarchism in the press, and in the popular, kind of a demonization of anarchists? Or was there something externally identifiable about anarchists in the way that they projected their, to each other signals?
So self-fashioned as anarchist in what sense? I'm just trying to make sure I understand.
Well, in other places, I'm thinking of Claudia's book where she talks about how anarchists actually did have a look, but the state also had a view of the look that they had. And so, did they have a look?
So a couple of things. Something I didn't talk about is the ways in which the category of anarchist itself is at play at the time. So even in 1918 and 1919 and 1920, just to take someone like Casimiro Barrios, for example, he's a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. Some people in that party are really angry at him because they think he's an anarchist, and he's been accused of being an anarchist, and he's bringing the law down on their backs. Others in the party defend him and say he's not an anarchist and that he should become secretary of the Socialist Workers' Party. He himself refers to himself in a variety of different ways at various points in time. But generally, when being interviewed by the press on the verge of being expelled, calls himself a free thinker. So the category of anarchist itself is very fluid. And that's part of what I'm very interested in. And so I don't think there's to my mind, there's not, I've tried to think about the politics of style. And there's not a lot I've been able to sort of find on this specific period, but it's clear that there's a politics to self-presentation, which is one that certainly both the students in the Fetch and men like Barrios and others, which is the politics of their style is one which is fairly, I don't want to call it bourgeois, but it's a kind of sense of dignity in how one dresses, right? In the sense of kind of professionalism and so forth. So I haven't noticed anything that would be a kind of anarchist style in that respect. Some of the men I didn't talk about, Armando Trevino, one of the most important ones, perhaps, who was very adamant about his anarchist politics. Same thing. There's not a kind of distinction in style. It's fairly consistent, and so I don't see anything like that in particular. In terms of actual kind of other kinds of markers, yeah, I don't know. If you look at the images of the big protests, the demonstrations around, for example, food exports and hunger and things like that, you can see the styles that people are appropriating, and they're fairly consistent in terms of the hats they wear and the kinds of jackets and collared shirts and so forth. So, yeah, not that I've been able to determine anyway. Yeah. Yeah, Sean.
Hey, thanks a lot. That was really wonderful. I was wondering if you could just return just for a moment when you were talking about ways of sort of identifying in the ways in which the state identifies these negative influences among anarchists. And you mentioned Peruvians and sort of relating that to not only proximity but sort of geopolitical history.
Right.
The reason why I ask is because it seems like I'm studying something similar in Cuba around this time also, in that Spanish influences, like the designation Spanish, whether it be publications or people or a certain kind of labor force, was sort of an etiquette that was very easily identified as being one of these negative influences that's sort of a cause, right, or a motivating factor of anarchism. And you mentioned the Peruvians, you mentioned Russians, and I'm wondering what specifically about Spanish anarchists in Chile have you sort of come across, or are there any sort of significations associated with Spanish anarchists in Chile?
So I haven't come across certain kinds of specifics, but the thing that you're referencing right there, this is a decree that's passed which requires all intendants, governors basically, in the country to set up an office of registration and to register all foreigners. And it's absolutely clear, right? I mean, you don't have to read between the lines. Peruvians are first, and it's Peruvian men between the ages of 17 and 25, right? And then come the next Peruvian men, and so on and so forth. So it's Peruvians because, I mean, I didn't talk about that here, but in the book, each chapter has stuff around this because there's a lot of issues around Chileanizing the North. And at this point in time, when there's an effort to register people and potentially expel people, what is the status of people who were born in what is now the North when it was the south of Peru, or immediately afterwards when there was a temporary occupying force? And people are writing and saying, listen, I don't, my status was never determined, right? But I'm Chilean. And the response constantly is, if you don't have any documents to prove this, right, there's a whole series of things that are passed, and multiple people are expelled under these kinds of things. Peruvians are the ones who have to register first. Yeah, Spanish are next because, I mean, the Russians are next because of Bolshevism, sure, clearly, right? And again, it's age criteria. And then the Spanish are seen as anarchists, and then the Italians are seen as anarchists, right? And so it's definitely, right, it's really readable in that way. In terms of, I'm trying to think about other kinds of ways in which these things are sort of read through. I mean, Barrios is from Spain, but when he's expelled, there's a whole cock-up because they can't expel him because the ship won't take him because he doesn't have a passport. Right? And he refuses, right? This is why I'm saying there has to be another language to talk about people, and whether it's sedentary or something else, I don't know, but he refuses, right? He's like, I don't have a passport. And the ship won't take him, and so they can't figure out what to do. So they put him, because the ship was supposed to take him, and it's supposed to take him and drop him off, actually, in Panama. And instead, the ship takes him as far north as the northernmost portion of Chile, drops him off by land, the police disembark with him, and then escort him by foot across the border into Peru. Not into Bolivia, right? You're going to send your radicals to your enemy's border. So there's a whole series of complications that come up with that as well. The last thing I'll say is, when it came to anarchists and anarcho-syndicalists, the Chilean government was looking everywhere, and sometimes with good reason. Australia had a reputation for deporting its wobblies to Chile. So the Australian government would take its wobblies and stick them on the next boat to Valparaiso and hope it sunk halfway across. They'd stick them on the boat to Valparaiso and send them to Chile. And it led to an international incident in 1918 in which the British consul, as a representative of the Australian Commonwealth, had to come and talk to the Ministry of Foreign Relations about the constant dumping of anarcho-syndicalists from Australia on Chilean shores. And many of them made their way to Buenos Aires, in fact, as well. Tom Barker, one of the more famous ones. Anyway, that's a longer answer to your question. But yeah.
I've got a question for you, Ray. You mentioned the politics of insolence, and if we're going to talk about that for a minute, could you flip back to your first image?
The very first image?
Yeah, of Barrios.
Yeah, let me see if I always try to get the mouse to kind of show up. There it is. Yes, it's an interesting pose and face for a mugshot, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
So, is this readable within the construct of the politics of insolence? And I'm curious about the way in which that barrack came into conflict with later, in terms of a communist party discipline within the Communist Party of Chile. Later, I mean, is the politics of insolence something that got washed away as the 20th century proceeded? I'm thinking of Victor Serge, too. He starts off as an anarchist bank robber.
Right.
And then finally, that becomes no longer a mode or a bearing that he can perform. things are too serious for him and millions of others.
Yeah.
So I'm just asking about that interesting phrase, and if you could say a bit more about what you're dealing with in your last chapter.
Yeah. So one thing, first thing about this photo, absolutely. I mean, this is one of my favorite pictures in the whole book, precisely because there is, it's effectively a mugshot, but he is not going to submit, right? I mean, there is a bearing there that is really strong and impressive. And in fact, it comes through in the documents. I mean, like my experience with Barrios in the archives was one in which I didn't know of his existence, and then he would start to pop up in these police reports, and over the course of time, I started to pursue him wherever I possibly could. I was totally seduced by him, and it comes through. He's very cheeky, right? And he knows the intricacies of things like labor law better than some of the people who are purported to be the experts about it. And so these exchanges he can have about his rights in jail and so on and so forth are really powerful. So yeah, the bearing of Barrios is one. So I can't say a lot about what happens to this over the course of the 30s and after. Over the course of the 1920s, Barrios in particular sustains he sustains all of that cheekiness, all of that bearing. I've got photographs of him being put onto the train to be deported to Bolivia, and again, there's a kind of intensity there. At the same time, it's almost at moments carnivalesque, right? In some sense, and the documents I have related to his return to Chile in the north that lead to his execution. I mean, there's a sense in which there was no possible way that he was going to be done in. Right? I mean, it's pretty powerful. But yeah, in terms of the Communist Party, I'm not sure. I do have some photographs of Marcelo Segal, right, who ended up in exile in Amsterdam from the 1950s, and there's certainly some bearing there. I mean, there's it's a bearing that's, it's a big presence. So I don't know if it goes away. Yeah. Yes,
Thank
Ron?
you for that incredibly rich way. I want to pick up on the politics of incidents, right? You said, and I mean, the Caribbean, there's this idea of, I would say now, politics of irreverence, and lack of reputation, this principle of reputation, anchored in primarily it's gendered, the male principle. And these are people this is the side of society that is completely disempowered in the colonial structure or whatever. And it's a very sort of machismo principle. So I just want, to put that out there with the incidents, because I see a parallel, and then I was very intrigued by the way Oscar Wilde was appropriated there for a politics of insolence, because I'm thinking, where does sexuality come in here? In the sense that, was this something that also traveled, or was the sexuality component not necessarily a part of what the Chilean world shared in terms of the appropriation of Oscar Wilde? And Oscar Wilde, it seems to me he was a man full of grace, and in terms of how he was actually within that society, even as he was outside because of his sexuality. You see what I mean? So I'm just trying to think about these figures, because they seem both. I don't know if that's a question as much as just trying to connect these different kinds of figures and moments with this very provocative capturing about politics of insolence.
Yeah. No, thanks for that. I mean, Oscar Wilde is one of the kind of things that I'm trying to work through right now with the chapter, and trying to learn more and sort of read more. And it's the politics of sexuality. It's hard in the sense that one of the things that's been quite frustrating in some ways, is the way in which the material that I'm looking at and referencing and so forth is sort of pulling me constantly in particular directions. In the immediate aftermath of this, so in 1921, the students in the Fetch, for example, start a new journal, Claridad, which is built on Henri Barbuse's journal Clarté, this kind of call for an international of intellectuals, anti-militaristic, socialist and anarchist. And they do it as a replacement to Newman because of what happens to the print shop and the paper goes out of circulation. The material in Claridad is much more dedicated. It still has a very strong vein towards translation of political works coming out from various parts of the world, and humor and so forth, but it's also intensely dedicated towards questions of things like sexuality. Juan Gandulfo writes a whole series of essays in the Claridad around sexuality, linking it to essentially questions of birth, social welfare, labor, and social welfare, but also the place of women in political structures in the university. And so there's a whole sort of question of gender and sexuality that together open up. But in 1918, 1919, and 1920, it seems very funnel, it's very tunnel vision in certain ways. So trying to peel out some of that has been difficult. The stuff with Wilde, I'm hoping, is one of the things that's going to yield things that will at least kind of pull and open up in a different direction, as well as some of the other poetry that Gomez Rojas has written, amongst others. I mean, in the politics of insolence and its kind of masculineness, yeah, I mean, I have to think about that a little bit further and dwell on it.
Yeah, it could just be so. Right?
Mhm.
Just to,
Yeah, no, but it's good to think about because it's one of the things that I haven't thought through in the context of the last chapter thus far. But what does strike me is the degree to which very careful, very thoughtful writers, political observers, who, you read so much of them, you come to trust them as narrators and thinkers and observers in a particular kind of way, like González Vera in particular, and the way in which they read insolence as the causative factor in what Gomez Rojas experienced and in his death. And they're not trying to gut his politics, they're not trying to deny his militancy, right? But they're really trying to identify a particular moment in the Chilean oligarchy's history, right? The parliamentary republic, which was not a republic, essentially. I mean, that's, I think there's something there to be said for that I want to kind of develop more without being pulled too far in the direction of sort of bohemian cultural questions, right, which has gotten a lot of attention. Actually, not that that's a problem, but I don't want to get pulled too far that direction. Thank you.
Well, let's thank Ray for the talk and have a glass of wine down the hallway.
Fair enough.